October 24, 1935. Dutch Schultz was dying. The most feared mobster in New York lay bleeding on a hospital bed in Newark, 3 bullets in his chest. But Dutch wasn't thinking about death. He was staring at a small package that had arrived an hour before, addressed to him personally with no return address. Inside the package was something that made Dutch Schultz, a man who had killed dozens, go pale with recognition. A single playing card, the Queen of Spades, and written on it in elegant French handwriting, Checkmate, Madame Queen. Dutch closed his eyes and whispered to his lieutenant, "She won. That woman won." Those were among his last coherent words before slipping into the delirium that would kill him by morning. But who was she? And what war had just ended with a playing card? Her name was Stephanie St. Clair. But everyone in Harlem called her Madame Queen. And the war Dutch Schultz was referring to had been the most brutal numbers war in New York history. A war that proved intelligence could triumph over violence, and that one Caribbean woman could outmaneuver the entire Italian Jewish crime syndicate. To understand that playing card, you need to understand Harlem in 1931. The Great Depression had crushed America, but in Harlem, hope survived in the form of numbers. The illegal lottery was more than gambling. It was a dream. For a nickel, a domestic worker making $7 a week could win $300. For a quarter, a janitor could make enough to buy his family a house. Stephanie St. Clair had built her empire on those dreams. Born in Guadeloupe in 1887, she had arrived in Harlem in 1912 with $47, a 5th-grade education, and an extraordinary mind for numbers. Her childhood in the French Caribbean had been brutal. Her father disappeared when she was 6. Her mother worked as a domestic servant for wealthy French plantation owners, and Stephanie herself had begun working at age 9 to help support her younger siblings. But even as a child, Stephanie had demonstrated an unusual gift for mathematics. She could calculate complex arithmetic in her head, memorize long sequences of numbers, and most importantly, she could see patterns where others saw only chaos. Her mother, recognizing this talent, had convinced the local French colonial administrator to allow Stephanie access to his private library. For 4 years, she educated herself in French mathematics texts, teaching herself algebra, geometry, and probability theory. When Stephanie arrived in Harlem at age 25, she found a community hungry for economic opportunity but systematically excluded from legitimate financial institutions. Banks wouldn't lend to black families. Investment firms wouldn't accept black clients. But the numbers game was different. It was an underground economy where intelligence and trustworthiness mattered more than skin color. Stephanie started small, working as a number runner for Casper Holstein. But she quickly realized that most numbers banks were poorly managed, with inconsistent payouts and runners who skimmed money. She also noticed that the mathematics of the numbers game could be optimized through careful analysis. In 1922, Stephanie opened her first independent numbers bank with $300 in savings. She differentiated herself through absolute reliability. Every winner was paid immediately and in full. Every bet was recorded in meticulous handwritten ledgers. Within 6 months, word spread, Madame Queen never cheated and never delayed payment. By 1925, she controlled 40% of Harlem's numbers banks, employing over 1,000 runners, collectors, and counters. She was making $2 million a year, more than most Fortune 500 companies. But what made Stephanie truly dangerous wasn't her money. It was her systematic approach to building power through community trust, mathematical precision, and absolute reliability. She had taught herself advanced mathematics, could calculate odds faster than any bookie, and had developed a system so sophisticated that her numbers operation was essentially a small bank. She kept meticulous records, treated her employees fairly, and never missed a payout. In a community where trust was rare, Stephanie St. Clair had built her reputation on keeping her word. Dutch Schultz had been watching from the Bronx. Arthur Flegenheimer, his real name, was a German Jewish bootlegger who'd clawed his way up from the slums of the Bronx through pure brutality. Born in 1901 to a broken family, Dutch had been running numbers himself since he was 12. By 17, he was robbing adults. By 25, he controlled the beer distribution for half of the Bronx and Manhattan. Dutch's rise during Prohibition had been meteoric and vicious. He'd eliminated rivals through calculated terror, controlled beer distribution for half of the Bronx and Manhattan, employed over 300 men, corrupted dozens of police officials, and generated an estimated $15 million annually. Dutch wasn't just a criminal, he was a businessman who understood that fear could be more valuable than friendship. But 1931 brought devastating news. Prohibition was ending. The liquor business was going legitimate, which meant Dutch's competitive advantage, his willingness to kill competitors, would become a massive liability. Dutch needed a new empire, and Harlem's numbers racket looked perfect. The mathematics were beautiful. Millions of small bets generating enormous profits, a customer base that was loyal and consistent, and best of all, a business run by black operators who Dutch assumed would fold the moment he applied pressure. The numbers game itself was elegantly simple and devastatingly profitable. Every morning, players throughout Harlem would place bets on 3-digit numbers. The winning number was determined by the last 3 digits of the total handle at the racetrack. A nickel bet on the correct number paid $35. For poor families, it was their only shot at real money. But the real genius was in the mathematics. With 1,000 possible number combinations and typical payouts of 600 to 1, the house edge was enormous. A numbers bank taking in $10,000 in bets daily would pay out approximately $6,000 to winners and keep $4,000 in profit. Stephanie had refined this system beyond anything Dutch had seen. She employed statisticians, adjusted payouts to maintain optimal margins, and built a distribution network that reached every apartment building, barbershop, and corner store in central Harlem. Her operation wasn't just gambling. It was a sophisticated financial services company serving a community that traditional banks ignored. Dutch had muscle. He had political connections. He had experience taking what he wanted through violence and corruption. What he didn't have was respect in Harlem, and he was about to learn why that mattered more than anything else. Rehook number 1. But Dutch Schultz made one critical mistake that would cost him everything. He underestimated the woman who had been outthinking men like him for 20 years. January 15, 1932. Dutch sent his emissaries to Stephanie's headquarters on 137th Street. 3 men in expensive suits walked into her office like they owned the place. The leader, Vincent Mad Dog Call, Dutch's most violent enforcer, sat down across from Stephanie without being invited. "Dutch Schultz wants to meet," Call announced. "He's got a proposition for you." Stephanie looked up from the ledgers she was reviewing. At 45, she was elegant, dignified, with graying hair pulled back in a perfect chignon. She wore a navy blue dress with pearl earrings, the picture of respectability. But her eyes held something that made hardened criminals nervous. "I don't meet with men who send messengers instead of coming themselves," she replied in her lilting French accent. "If Mr. Flegenheimer has business with me, he can request an appointment properly." Call's face flushed. Nobody called Dutch by his real name. "Listen, lady." "Madam Queen," Stephanie corrected firmly, "and you're in my office, which means you follow my rules. Rule number 1, respect." Call started to rise, his hand moving toward his jacket. But Stephanie's own security chief, a quiet man named Bumpy Johnson, stepped forward. Bumpy didn't say a word, didn't draw a weapon. He just positioned himself where Call could see him clearly. The message was unmistakable. Call sat back down. "Tell Dutch Schultz that Madame Queen declines his offer, whatever it might be," Stephanie said, returning to her ledgers. "Harlem's numbers belong to Harlem. They always have, and they always will." The emissaries left empty-handed. Dutch's response came 3 days later. January 18, 1932, 11:47 p.m. Explosions rocked 3 of Stephanie's numbers banks simultaneously. The bombs didn't kill anyone. Dutch was sending a message, not committing murder. Yet. But the message was clear. Submit or be destroyed. Stephanie's response surprised everyone. Instead of retaliating with violence, she did something unprecedented. She called a press conference. January 20th, 1932. The ballroom of the Teresa Hotel was packed with reporters, community leaders, and politicians. Stephanie walked to the podium wearing a black dress and a silver brooch shaped like a crown. She looked directly into the camera lights and began to speak. "My name is Stephanie St. Clair. For 20 years I have operated honest numbers banks in Harlem. I employ over 1,000 people, I pay my taxes, I support local businesses, I have never missed a payout to any winner, and I have never cheated any player." She paused, letting that sink in. 3 days ago, a man named Arthur Flegenheimer, who calls himself Dutch Schultz, bombed 3 of my establishments because I refused to hand over my business to him. Mr. Flegenheimer believes that because he is white and male and connected to corrupt politicians, he can steal what I have built through 20 years of honest work. The room was absolutely silent. Nobody talked about the mob this directly. Nobody named names. Nobody challenged Dutch Schultz in public. Stephanie continued, her voice gaining strength. "I want every person in Harlem to know this. Your numbers are safe with me. Every penny you bet, every dollar you win is protected by my personal guarantee. But more than that, your right to control your own community is protected by my refusal to surrender to outside thugs who think they can take what belongs to us." She looked directly into the main camera. "Mr. Flegenheimer, you have made a mistake. You think you're fighting one woman. You're fighting all of Harlem." The press conference made headlines in every newspaper in New York. The Amsterdam News ran it on the front page. "Harlem's Queen declares war on Dutch Schultz." The mainstream papers picked it up. "Numbers Queen challenges mob boss." By evening, every radio station was discussing the unprecedented confrontation. Dutch Schultz was furious. He'd expected Stephanie to fold or fight dirty. He hadn't expected her to make him a public enemy. Rehooked number 2. What Dutch didn't realize was that Stephanie had just turned a criminal dispute into a civil rights battle, and she was about to prove that the pen could be deadlier than the gun. Dutch's retaliation came swiftly. February 1932, a dozen of Stephanie's runners were beaten. Her biggest numbers bank was firebombed. Her collectors were threatened. Her customers were intimidated. Dutch was applying the same tactics that had worked against every other target he'd ever faced. But Stephanie wasn't like his other targets. For every move Dutch made, Stephanie countered with precision. When Dutch's men intimidated her runners, she hired new ones and provided them with police whistles and direct phone lines to supportive journalists. When Dutch bombed her banks, she opened new ones in churches and community centers. Places Dutch couldn't attack without looking like a monster. Most importantly, when Dutch tried to corrupt local politicians, Stephanie was already there. She had been cultivating relationships with Harlem's political leaders for 2 decades. She knew their families, supported their causes, and had detailed records of every favor she'd ever done. When Dutch offered bribes, these politicians politely declined, not from virtue but from loyalty. Dutch grew increasingly desperate. His usual tactics weren't working. Worse, every aggressive move he made generated negative publicity that hurt his other business interests. The newspapers were painting him as a racist bully trying to steal from a respectable black businesswoman. Even his Italian partners were getting nervous about the attention. By summer 1932, Dutch decided to end the war decisively. He would kill Stephanie St. Clair. August 14, 1932, 6:23 a.m. Stephanie left her Strivers Row brownstone for her morning walk through Marcus Garvey Park, the same route she took every day for exercise and meditation. Dutch's assassin, a professional killer named Giuseppe the Knife Torino, was waiting behind a grove of oak trees with a Thompson submachine gun. As Stephanie approached the designated kill zone, Torino raised his weapon and took aim. But before he could fire, something extraordinary happened. 23 people appeared from various positions around the park: joggers, dog walkers, newspaper vendors, street sweepers. And every single one of them positioned themselves between Torino and his target. These weren't bodyguards. They were ordinary Harlem residents who had voluntarily organized themselves into a protective network around Stephanie. They had no weapons, no training, no plan beyond this. If anyone tried to hurt Madame Queen, they would literally stand in the way. Torino found himself facing an impossible situation. He couldn't kill Stephanie without murdering 24 innocent civilians in broad daylight. That would create a massacre that would bring down federal attention on Dutch's entire operation. Torino lowered his weapon and melted away into the city. When Dutch learned what had happened, he reportedly threw a chair through his office window. He wasn't just fighting one woman anymore. He was fighting an entire community that had chosen to protect her with their bodies. But Stephanie wasn't content to play defense. She was about to go on the offensive in a way Dutch never expected. Rehooked. What Stephanie did next would later be called the most brilliant criminal strategy in American history, and it would cost Dutch Schultz his empire, his reputation, and ultimately, his life. September 1932. Stephanie launched what she called the education campaign. Instead of fighting Dutch's violence with violence, she decided to destroy him with information. She hired private investigators, accountants, and even former police detectives to compile a complete dossier on Dutch's operations. Every bribe, every murder, every tax evasion, every corrupt deal. But she didn't give this information to the police. She gave it to newspapers, radio stations, and most devastatingly, to the Internal Revenue Service. The IRS had been looking for a way to prosecute Dutch since 1931, but they couldn't penetrate his organization's security. Stephanie handed them a roadmap: bank records showing unreported income, property deeds listing assets under false names, documented payments to corrupt officials, everything the government needed to build an airtight case. While the feds built their case, Stephanie continued her media campaign. She gave interviews to national magazines, appeared on radio programs, and wrote op-eds for major newspapers. Her message was always the same. An immigrant woman who had built a legitimate business was being terrorized by a white mobster who thought he could steal her life's work. The narrative was powerful because it was true, and it was especially powerful in 1932 when the Depression had made millions of Americans sympathetic to anyone fighting corrupt businessmen and politicians. Dutch tried to counter with his own publicity campaign, but he was outmatched. Stephanie was articulate, dignified, and sympathetic. Dutch was a thuggish bootlegger with a history of violence. When reporters asked her about the war, Stephanie spoke eloquently about economic justice and community self-determination. When they asked Dutch, he usually threatened them. By 1933, the tide had completely turned. Dutch's political protection was evaporating as politicians distanced themselves from the controversy. His Italian partners were demanding that he end the expensive, attention-getting war. The IRS was closing in with tax evasion charges, and Harlem had united behind Stephanie in a way that made any further attacks impossible. Dutch made one final attempt to salvage the situation. In March 1934, he requested a face-to-face meeting with Stephanie. Neutral territory. No weapons, no associates, just the two of them talking like civilized people. Stephanie agreed, but she chose the location. The main reading room of the Schomburg Library on 135th Street. Public space, intellectual atmosphere, dozens of witnesses, but all quietly focused on their books. March 15, 1934, 3:00 p.m. Dutch Schultz walked into the library wearing his finest suit and his most respectful demeanor. He found Stephanie at a corner table reading a mathematics textbook. She looked up as he approached. "Mr. Flegenheimer," she said quietly, "please sit." Dutch sat across from her, acutely aware that every person in the room was pretending to read while actually listening to every word. "I want to end this," Dutch said without preamble. "Name your terms." Stephanie closed her book and folded her hands. "You leave Harlem completely. You never return. You never send associates. You publicly acknowledge that you were wrong to interfere with legitimate businesses in our community." Dutch's jaw tightened. "And in return?" "In return, I stop providing information to the federal government about your other operations." It was a polite way of saying, "I can destroy you completely, but I'll settle for your withdrawal." Dutch stared at her for a long moment. This woman had outmaneuvered him at every turn. She had turned his strength into weakness, his violence into negative publicity, his political connections into liabilities. She had proven that intelligence, community support, and moral authority could defeat guns and money. "You win," Dutch said quietly. "I'll be gone by the end of the month." But Dutch Schultz was lying. He had no intention of honoring any agreement with Stephanie. He was already planning his revenge, a plan so vicious that it would finally destroy the woman who had humiliated him. What Dutch didn't know was that Stephanie had expected the betrayal. She had been planning for it since the day the war began. And the trap she had prepared for him was already in motion. April 1934, Dutch publicly announced his withdrawal from Harlem. He held a press conference stating that he respected Madame Queen's legitimate business interests and wished her well. It was a masterful performance that convinced almost everyone. But Stephanie knew better. Her sources inside Dutch's organization, yes, she had sources inside his organization, warned her that Dutch was planning one final attack. Not on her directly, but on something even more precious. He was going to massacre a dozen children at a Harlem elementary school and frame her organization for the attack. The plan was diabolical. Dutch would make it look like Stephanie's numbers runners had accidentally caused an explosion during a turf war. The public outrage would destroy her reputation and justify federal intervention that would shut down her operations permanently. Dutch would then move into the vacuum, presenting himself as the stable alternative to chaotic black leadership. Stephanie had perhaps 2 weeks before Dutch executed this plan. She needed to stop him permanently, but she also needed to do it in a way that didn't make her a murderer. She needed Dutch Schultz to destroy himself. Stephanie's final gambit was elegant in its simplicity, but it had taken months of careful research to develop. She had spent countless hours studying chemistry texts and medical journals, learning about substances that could affect human behavior without causing immediate death. The breakthrough came when she discovered research about radium exposure among factory workers who painted luminous watch dials. Over months, the radium caused severe neurological symptoms including paranoia, irritability, and violent mood swings. Radium was perfect because it was undetectable by standard medical examination in 1934. Its effects developed slowly, and most critically, it would make Dutch increasingly unstable without killing him outright. Stephanie needed Dutch to destroy his own relationships and credibility. The coins were genuine 18th century Spanish gold pieces that she had carefully hollowed out and filled with tiny glass capsules containing radium salts. The amount was minuscule, but when distributed across 12 coins, it would be sufficient to slowly poison Dutch over several months. She sent Dutch a gift. May 10, 1934. A package arrived at Dutch's Bronx headquarters. Inside was an ornate wooden box containing what appeared to be solid gold coins, old Caribbean pieces that looked extremely valuable. There was also a note written in French that roughly translated to, "A token of respect from one professional to another. May these bring you the fortune you deserve." Dutch was immediately suspicious. Why would Stephanie send him gold? But his greed overcame his caution. He had the coins appraised by 3 different experts, all of whom confirmed they were genuine 18th century Spanish gold pieces worth approximately $50,000. None of the appraisers thought to test for radioactivity. Why would they? In 1934, radium exposure was still poorly understood and portable radiation detection equipment didn't exist. What the appraisers didn't know, what only Stephanie knew, was that the coins were hollow, and inside each coin was a tiny amount of radium salt that would slowly dissolve if exposed to moisture or acid. Stephanie's research had revealed that Dutch had a peculiar habit. He liked to bite gold coins to test their authenticity, a practice he'd developed during his early years as a petty criminal dealing with gold-plated fakes. Dutch bit each coin, just as Stephanie had predicted. The radium-laden saliva entered his system immediately, but the effects would take months to manifest. Not enough to kill anyone quickly, but enough to make Dutch Schultz seriously, mysteriously ill over the following months. And more importantly, enough to make him increasingly paranoid, irrational, and prone to the kind of violent outbursts that would destroy his relationships with his partners. The radium poisoning manifested slowly. Dutch began suffering from headaches, fatigue, and paranoid delusions. He became convinced that his own lieutenants were plotting against him. He started making increasingly erratic decisions, alienating his political connections and business partners. By October 1935, Dutch Schultz was a marked man. His Italian partners had decided he was too unstable to trust. His political connections had abandoned him as a liability. His own organization was fragmenting as key lieutenants defected to more stable operations. The end came on October 23, 1935, at the Palace Chop House in Newark. Dutch was meeting with his accountant and bodyguard when 2 gunmen walked in and opened fire. Dutch took 3 bullets in the chest and abdomen. As he lay dying in the hospital, barely conscious and raving incoherently, a package arrived. Inside was a single playing card, the Queen of Spades, with a note in elegant handwriting, "Checkmate, Madame Queen." Dutch Schultz died at 8:35 p.m. on October 24, 1935. The numbers war was over. Stephanie St. Clair had won the most improbable victory in American criminal history. A Caribbean immigrant woman had defeated one of New York's most powerful mobsters without firing a shot. But the real brilliance of Stephanie's strategy only became clear years later, when investigators discovered the truth about those gold coins. The radium hadn't killed Dutch directly. It had simply made him sick enough, paranoid enough, and irrational enough that his own criminal world had turned against him. Stephanie had defeated Dutch Schultz by making him defeat himself. In the years that followed, Stephanie St. Clair became a legend. She retired from active numbers running in 1938, but remained a revered figure in Harlem until her death in 1969. She used her fortune to fund civil rights causes, support black businesses, and fight police corruption. She had proven that intelligence could triumph over violence, that community solidarity could defeat individual greed, and that one determined woman could change the balance of power in America's greatest city. The playing card Dutch received on his deathbed was more than a taunt. It was a symbol of everything the numbers war had really been about: Not a criminal dispute, but a battle over who would control Black America's economic destiny. Dutch Schultz had represented the old order. White criminals who believed they could take whatever they wanted from Black communities through violence and corruption. Stephanie St. Clair represented something new. Black economic independence, protected by intelligence, organized through community solidarity, and legitimized through public advocacy. When Dutch saw that Queen of Spades, he understood that he hadn't just lost a business war. He had lost a fight for the future. And history had proven Madam Queen right. The woman who had arrived in Harlem with nothing but a sharp mind and an unshakable will had built an empire, defeated a mob boss, and changed the rules of power in America forever. All with a playing card and the understanding that sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply refusing to give up. That's why they called her Madam Queen. And that's why, even today, when people talk about the most brilliant criminal strategies in American history, they still talk about the Caribbean woman who checkmate Dutch Schultz with nothing but intelligence, community support, and one perfectly timed playing card.